Bram, gracias por esta conversación.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm going to speak to you in Spanish. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're doing well. Thank you so much for this conversation today more than ever. It is very clear the connection that we have between food systems, climate change, and food insecurity. And that's why we made a decision at GFN to have this conversation and to put this conversation on the public agenda. This interconnection becomes relevant, especially because of the very important role that food banks play right now to reduce the climate change impact and how this climate change impact is affecting the most vulnerable populations. He was very clear. And just to highlight his message about climate change that sometimes is sort of invisible. Right now, living through it, I said it at the beginning of this conference, we see an increase in precipitation, rain, and natural disasters. Extreme disasters we have more and more all the time, and this affects the most vulnerable population again, and that's the population that we serve as food banks. The connection with food waste and loss is that, according to the FAO, the estimates are that if food waste and loss were a country, they would be the third country in generation of emissions in the world after the US and China. Additionally to that, all the food waste and loss that we are generating ends up generating methane, and that is a very impactful gas, very negative for climate change, more so than carbon dioxide. 25% of emissions come from methane. So finally, what is this impact over this most vulnerable population? We're talking that about the fact that climate change and food waste and loss increase food insecurity, and on top of that, they also increase poverty, and that way they generate less ability to have resiliency, especially the population that is the most vulnerable already. And what we see now is climate change increases food insecurity because it reduces the capability of countries to produce enough food, enough of the necessary food they need to feed the most vulnerable population. At the same time, it makes the health situation even worse in low-income countries and middle-income countries where the social protection systems are not really developed. If we see an increase in the number of disease, public health problems, that increases the risk, that increases poverty and food insecurity also. Energy poverty, that is one of the most important issues right now too. Power poverty is also going up because there is low capacity that countries cannot respond to this because of climate change. And lastly, but not less important, and we're living this right now, the housing problems that become even worse with the climate change for this population that lives in poverty. It generates displacement because of the precipitation, intense precipitation that we see. And again, it's the most vulnerable population. And that's why we think that GFN, we believe that this is very relevant and this is very important. We have to put it in the public agenda and we have to talk about the connection between climate change and food insecurity. And finally, the food systems. And that's why today I want to invite some great partners that we have, our food banks that are in the end making it possible. I would invite Alyson to this panel. She is our commercial director. She is our commercial director at FareShare, the UK food bank. Gidi, welcome. So great to have you. He's the CEO at Leket, Israel, our food bank in Israel. Welcome. And lastly, not less important, Jacques, welcome to the panel. It's great to be able to talk to you today. He is our president at the European Federation of Food Banks. Please, go ahead. Well, this is a conversation. So what we're going to do, we have the microphones ready and open in case you have questions for us. I'm sure we do not have all the answers, but we're going to think together. And sometimes the questions are more important than the answers. So welcome to the panel. Thank you very much for being here. Alyson, I would like to start with you, if you allow me. I'm sorry, Gidi, I apologize. 2003. That's when Leket Israel was created. And starting in 2003, you'll be working on environmental issues and also on issues that have to do with food rescue and how to serve food to the most vulnerable population. Nowadays, Leket Food Bank in Israel distributes 100% of their food they distribute is fruits and vegetables. So today, fruits and vegetables generate a huge impact in the reduction of food waste and loss. It has a huge environmental impact, and it increases diversity and quality of the food that we're distributing to the most vulnerable populations. Gidi, do you see the food bank in Israel as a climate change solution or as a program that reduces hunger in your country?
First of all, thank you for having us here, for having me here. I think it's a great opportunity to share a lot of information that we have. Leket Israel, our goal is to rescue as much food as we can. And I once put it that Leket will lead food rescue initiatives and but will join into food insecurity initiatives because our mission is food rescue. Now, we didn't start the organization years ago in order to deal with the climate change. That's not who we are. And I think we should be very careful as food bankers as well to think of what our focus is, because our focus is food. Now, there's some that procure food, and there's some that rescue food, like Leket Israel. And I think the initiatives of food rescue should be growing all over the world. There is enough food in the world to feed. The problem is, of course, logistics and moving it. You can't move food from America to the US or rescued food because it won't arrive in Africa, for instance, in a safe way. But I think Leket Israel's, our goal is first of all and foremost to rescue food and not climate. Yes, the whole food rescue issue stands on 4 pillars: an economic issue, there's a health issue, which is mostly nutrition, there's a social issue, closing the social gap, and of course there's the environmental issue. We focus in Israel on food rescue. We do focus on closing the gap, and then the health, the nutrition. I think that's our goal is. In 2022, we finished with almost 28,000 tons of fresh food rescued from fields in all over Israel, and we can probably do a lot more. Our report that we distribute with, or that was written by BDO, commissioned by us, but written by BDO, claims that there is 700,000 tons of fresh produce available in the field. So if you look at what Leket is doing, we're probably doing 5%. If you say that 700,000 tons is an exaggeration because maybe some of it is not fit for human consumption, then we're still talking, let's take off 50% of it, then we're talking about 10%. So our horizon is huge. We can do probably a lot more. And then the question is how we finance it. And that's the only question left. If we had more finance for it, we could do more. We know how to do more. We increased threefold since the beginning of COVID. We were not threefold, we doubled. We were at 15,000 tons before COVID, and now our goal for this year is going to be 30, and we're probably 30,000 tons. We're probably going to surpass it.
Thank you. The work that you're doing is very impressive. What you're doing in Israel is very impressive. From GFM, we've been promoting the increase of food rescue, especially for food like fruits and vegetables in every country, as a key element to improve nutrition and the quality of the food that we're distributing. And the numbers that we're hearing for rescue, the total number of food banks rescue approximately 1% of all food that is lost, wasted. So just like you say, we have an immense space left. We have a lot of room to grow. Alyson, who was in London in 2019 at FBLI? Raise your hand if you were there. We were in London in FBLI 2019. Those of us that were there, we remember, Alyson, that your CEO made the announcement, he said the London Food Bank was an environmental organization. Translate that for us. Translate it to Spanish, as we would say in Latin America. Tell us a little bit, what does that mean? What does it mean to be an environmental organization? And why is a food bank calling itself an environmental organization?
Thank you for having us from the UK, from FareShare. We're absolutely overwhelmed by the opportunity of meeting so many of you. And actually, it's really interesting to sit next to Leket because we have so much in common. Apologies then if I repeat some of the similar situation. But FareShare was set up about 30 years ago, and just to give you some brief background, we came about because of an idea, because of a conversation at a homeless charity. And there was an event at Christmas where food was given by the food industry, and it went so well that the organisers at the homeless charity said, I wish we could do this all year round, it's been fantastic. And the representative from the food industry said, well, you absolutely could, because there's so much food all year round. So that was the light bulb moment where an idea became a project, and eventually that project became the independent charity that is FareShare. So almost 30 years later, we maintain that we're an environmental charity, not because we had the thought of climate change at the beginning, but because of the loss of a resource or the waste of resource. And we did some research a couple of years ago, and we found that people were angry about food waste. They were concerned about food insecurity, so a very different dynamic. So for us, what we do is we use surplus food as the asset by which to do social goods. And thinking about your statistics as well, we know from a recent report that there are 3 million tonnes of surplus food in the UK. FareShare redistributes 55,000 tonnes, which sounds like we're not doing enough, and we are, but actually there is so much more that we can do, and that's what powers us on and gives us the enthusiasm to do it. We know that by redistributing food, we're stopping carbon emissions from being needlessly wasted. And I think a bit later we're going to talk about a carbon project. So the expression needlessly wasted is really important. But for us, food is the asset that helps our 9,500 charities perform their social good by providing the wraparound services that they do, which aren't only about food insecurity. They support mental health and well-being, domestic abuse, all manner of isolation in older people. So for us, our starting point was about maximising this really valuable resource that was going to waste. So from that point of view, we're environmental. And I would say that our chief executive would maintain that if the surplus food wasn't there anymore, we would stop what we were doing and go home. But there will always be surplus food. The challenge is getting it. And I think that's what we'll be talking about together over the course of the next few days, is how challenging it is, because we have this perfect storm of political unrest, of climate, political in the UK, we had Brexit, which meant it was harder to get drivers and trucks. I have a very talented colleague in the second row. I actually have lots of talented colleagues in the second row who are agile and reactive to try and find these solutions. And the food that we want and that our charities need isn't always available in the mix and the type that they always want. So the creativity that we have to move into as a space, which we saw at APT yesterday, which is making things out of the product that there is. We're just getting into repacking of bulk items. We're making soup out of bulk vegetables because not all the vegetables are available at the same time. So these are the ways in which we will optimise and maximise the available food. But for us, that's the source, and it's surplus. During the peak of the pandemic, when we doubled our food output, we worked with the government on a food buy, and that was fine for then, but that's not financially sustainable. There are no environmental benefits, and that's not the place that we're going to go. But we are lobbying the government for a £25 million ask to get more food out of the ground, particularly produce, and to support farmers to be able to use this resource that otherwise they can't afford to farm. So that's our key focus. We do take some donated food, but the focus of what we're wanting to get is this really valuable resource of surplus that shouldn't be wasted. So for us, it's about the loss of a resource rather than necessarily climate change as such.
Alyson, gracias.
Alyson, you mentioned a subject that's very interesting, very relevant, what you call the perfect storm. And I think within that perfect storm that's recognized at the global level, and which actually exists, in Europe, there's a concept that even though it's true that it's everywhere now, it hasn't been as adopted as it has been in Europe, the economy, the circular economy concept. I think it's a very relevant concept because it does not focus on just one sector, but it allows for the interaction amongst different sectors around what a more resilient world means for all its inhabitants. Can you explain to us a little bit that concept of circular economy and what's the role of the European Federation of Food Banks is seeing, the role of food banks within that concept of circular economy, and what is our responsibility to work in food waste and loss?
Thank you. Today in Europe, 57 million tons of food are being wasted every year. That is equivalent to 130 billion euros if we transfer that waste into economic terms. It is also thought that 10% more or less of the food that is made available to the customer is actually wasted. And whilst that is the scenario in Europe today, 36.2 million people cannot afford a quality meal every second day. So the implication of food banks in circular economy has started, well, the implication is there since the inception of food banks. Since the very beginning of the food bank's existence, they were actually part of the circular economy without knowing it.
Exactly.
But today, we can say in Europe in 2015, there was a big regulation that was promulgated by the European Commission about circular economy, and people start moving in that direction. If we zoom on FEBA members' activities, then we can say that the general environment has changed. That has been so clearly indicated already by Lisa Moon in her preliminary comments. $7,388 tons of fruit and vegetables from produce withdrawn from the market. Now, this is a very peculiarity of the European Common Agricultural Policy, is that to keep the prices of fruit and vegetable at a certain level, when there is an overproduction, that production is actually withdrawn from the market. It is subsidized by the European Union to the producer, and the food banks can actually have access to that quantity. I would venture that to say that the reputation of food banks has considerably increased in Europe, and I would say that this is the result of various factors. The one is the professionalization of our structure. The move from Paris to Brussels has been important. Higher visibility and participation in the EU specialized platforms. There are many platforms. I will probably detail that more this afternoon in the next panel, but there are several different platforms to which FEBA is actually representing the food banking world, and I think that has been quite important to support our agenda to reducing food waste. I didn't talk about food donation, as this is the purpose of the next panel at which I will participate. But yeah, I would think there is still a lot of things to do, but you know, maybe I should finish on a Mark Twain citation that would say, they thought it would be impossible, so they did it.
Cierto. Jacques, gracias.
That's very true. Jacques, thank you very much. It is incredible that, you know, since 1960, we've had food banks in the world, and we've only been able to put in the public agenda the issue of food waste and loss after 2012. And in addition to that, today, many people still do not recognize the tight relationship that exists between food banks, food waste and loss, food systems, and climate change. For us, it's obvious, but it seems that it's still not obvious in many sectors. And our big task is to continue promoting, to continue showing the strong relation that exists between food banks, food insecurity, and climate change. Grant, you come from a different place, and it's wonderful to have you here in this panel because that allows us to contrast, to see our job from an external perspective. We don't expect, and I'm speaking in general terms, we don't expect for agricultural production to be donated to food banks. We expect small, medium, and large producers to be able to access the commercial chain, to sell what they can, and whatever they are not able to sell or distribute or compose or use for animal feed, we want them to deliver it to us. But of course, we want it to be commercialized. We want it to be in the supply chain, because we know that in this global south, 80% of producers are small and medium, and that affects those poverty indexes in the region. Now, you're participating in this conversation now. What are those innovation elements that the agricultural sector is using now to reduce the food waste? Okay. To be equitable here, I'm going to answer in Spanish. I've been listening attentively to the discussion here, and it is clear that we come from different perspectives, but I believe that if we have a systemic approach and we look at agricultural and food systems, we're talking about the same thing in many senses. My first thought is that when we look at food, we have to be very clear, but that this is based on the sweat and tears of the people who produced it. And these producers have to turn this food that they produce into some value, some monetary value. Now, also, you can look at it from the energy point of view. Any energy that's wasted has an impact on climate change. And of course, the food banks have a big role to play in the mitigation of climate change, because it's energy. I mean, climate change is a energy that's dissipating outside the system, an energy that's leaving the system in many ways. If you rescue that food and you give it a second life, you give it another life, that plays a role there. And I do think we have common points. With that systemic vision, we need to understand better when we make decisions what follows, or who is next to us and whom I am impacting. So obviously CIMMYT is not going to rescue food. What we do is what's left, we compost it, and in simple terms, we return it to the soil. It's something that can be used. So our challenge there is that a lot of this goes out to the cities and it's very difficult to bring it back. And everything that goes out to the city as energy, elements from the soil that we take remains in the city. It becomes a problem here and it cannot be returned here. But what I can say is that since we established a relationship with the food banks in Mexico, with Damex, the way I make decisions has changed, because if before, when I had to make a decision, very often I had maybe 3 options. To me, well, A, B, and C worked well. The impact I wanted to achieve was the same. But in discussions with the food banks in Mexico, it became clear to me that C would affect the efficiency, the efficacy of the food bank. So then I'm not going to opt for C. I'm going to choose solution A or B. Now, if there's something that I would like to convey here today, is that at the end of the day, yeah, we touch each other. If we understand these points where we contact, the better we understand them, the better decisions we will make working on the whole system. And in the end, that's circularity. We cannot manage the whole circle. We're never say never, but if we go to the macro systems, nobody manages the whole circle. So we have to understand these points of confluence to make decisions. Now, innovations in this sense, well, we're promoting the implementation of technologies with producers so that they can reduce food waste, and it has to do with better ways of storing food. Some things are very simple. It's, storing food in conditions where there's no oxygen. If there's no oxygen, there is no pests, there's no bacteria, there's nothing that spoils the food. This also allows the producer to play better, to be a better actor in the market. Cold chains, better cold chains, and of course they can handle the product better, taking it to market. But let's not forget that there is a lot of many producers in the global south that are feeding themselves, and that can be distorted heavily because of market forces, decisions taken in the market. And to that extent, food banks become a source of information for this producer on what to produce, what not to produce. So your presence already has changed the reality of this producer. How does it change it? You decide. But let's not forget that the fact that you have appearance in has already changed the decision making. So how do we make decisions? How do we optimize it? I think it needs to have, we need the knowledge of those who produce the food, first of all. For those of us who work on rescue programs on the fields, I mean, we're getting some very important elements about that process of convincing, of selling it. Changing that decision-making process from 3 options to, so that it gets to maybe just one that promotes donation to food banks. It's a big challenge. We're going to move to the second round. We're going to start the second 30-minute period of this discussion. And Alyson, I want to go back to you. You mentioned the fantastic carbon project that you're carrying out, and FareShare has been charged with the analysis of the environmental impact of the food bank operations. We would love for you to tell us a little bit more about that project.
Stage 1, we're just in the process of stage 2, but what I'd like to say is we're so happy to share all of the research with you, and then the final tool that we will be creating, hopefully by September, I think, is something that I hope would be of use and of interest to all food banks. But the reason why we started this is the fact that the nature of social and environmental impact reporting has changed a lot since we first started reporting on what we do. We've been very operationally focused in terms of our reporting with KPIs around tonnage of food that we've moved, number of charities served, and service users of those charities. But the depth and the sophistication around lives changed, social return on investment, and the environmental side of things made us feel that we weren't giving a true reflection of the work that we do. And there is a standard calculation about the amount of carbon emissions for food that is wasted, and we were using that and extrapolating it by the tonnage of food that we were moving. But we weren't taking into consideration our own carbon footprint, so we felt that we were saying one story about how much we were saving, but not being true about the impact of our own operations. So in the FareShare network, we have 36 warehouses across the UK. FareShare as a charity only operates and owns 3 of those. The rest are run by independent charities who are part of our network, a bit like we're all members of an association here. So our starting point was to look at our carbon footprint in our 3 warehouses, taking into account the carbon emissions of fuel used to get food into our warehouses, and we use mainly third-party logistics. We don't have our own big trucks going around the UK. We then have small trucks that take the food out to charities, and in the middle of all of that, we have electricity that we buy. We have electricity for the fridges and the freezers. We have the gases and the refrigerants that go into the chillers and the freezers, so all of these need to come together, plus the carbon emissions of the food and the water that goes into those. So we worked with the Carbon Trust, who are recognised for their work in this area, and we felt that they were a credible partner, to do a calculation of our footprint with the volume of carbon emissions from the food that we were redistributing. And it was hard. So if you're stepping out on this process, I would say be prepared, because you don't always have that information, and finding the invoices for all the electricity that you've bought and how much you've paid. You need extra resource, so go get yourself some volunteers or some students, I think.
Extra.
But what we came out as the conclusion from our own footprint is that for every tonne of carbon emissions that we used in our operations, we prevented 9 tonnes of carbon emissions being needlessly wasted. And that's the expression. We didn't prevent it from being wasted, we stopped it from being unnecessarily wasted, because obviously the original point was that food should go to be eaten in its first usage. So the second stage that we're just in at the moment is talking to our network partners to understand their fuel usage, electricity usage, and green gases within their own fridges. And coming together with all of that information, we want to build a calculator, which means that we won't have to repeat this research every year, but every 2 or 3 years we can just put the data in and come out with the information, and that should be robust enough to be able to give us good reporting. A, we want this from our own point of view, but B, we think this makes us a better partner for our food partners. The big companies, the big retailers, they will be doing this themselves, but the small and medium partners will value and benefit from this reporting so that they don't have to do it. So as well as giving them the social impact of what we're doing, we're giving them the environmental side. So I'll be excited in a few months' time, once we get to the stage 2 completion, to be able to come back and share that and perhaps show you the calculator and how it works. So stay tuned, I think is what I would say.
Vamos a estar, claramente.
Clearly. Now, if all of you have already downloaded the app for this event, I invite you to go there. We're going to post a link to the study, but you can also additionally contact Alyson through the app and invite her to talk. So we invite you to use the application, which should be used to contact us to talk about this. Thank you very much, Alyson. And today, more than ever, data is absolutely relevant. Data has a value today. We're going to have a day of work led by our chief of the board, Don Arnold, talking about the importance of data and why food banks nowadays should take care of the data that we produce as a way to show the impact on food insecurity, on hunger, but also on climate change. Your last report, my dear Gidi, is a wonderful report. Tell us a little bit about the data collection process and also about that wonderful report that you presented. And if we could do a double click on the section that talks about avoided or prevented emissions in your report.
I can definitely talk about this, but I want to go on a tangent here. Sorry, I have to. That's what I feel. I mean, and I have a question. It's nobody has to answer it right now, but let's say that, Alyson, in FareShare, okay, you found out that actually you have a negative impact on environment. As you know, a food organization deals with food, would you still continue doing your work? Because that's a question of focus, I think, of all the food bankers. And there's kind of a balance here that we have to work between having a positive impact on the environment and doing the focus of the work, which is, let's go down to really the basics of it, feeding people. And I think once we understand that, then all the other things are tools for us. I think carbon credit is awesome. It's an amazing but it's a tool that we can use for, I don't know, for financing an organization. It's important, and privately, I support all the environmental practices going on, and I'm a keen supporter of all the environment, and you're right what you said before about, I have a new granddaughter, 3-month-old, and she's going to live to be in 2100. And in 2100, not 2100 years, but she's going to live to be in these years, and it's important for us to think about this. But right now, I think it's also crucial for us to understand what is important in our work, what is the focus of our work, and a lot of initiatives should go around it. And that's why I went a little bit on a tangent, and we'll go back to the GAG. Like for instance, we're developing a software in Israel. I know that's going to be discussed somewhere else in the data panel. But we're developing a software now with supporting, the development is done by friends of the organization, pro bono, that will take satellites and look at Israeli fields. There are 2 European satellites going over Israel. And through these satellites, we know what is going with agriculture in Israel. We can define by a certain metric called NDIS, we know that this field is ready for picking, this field is not, and if we have a field that's ripe and ready for picking, we can approach the farmer and ask him. So that, again, that's using technology and getting as much knowledge that we can in order to produce better, to do our work a lot better. And if I go into utilization and what you spoke about before as well, the cost of rescuing fresh produce for us in Leket, Israel, is 18 cents a pound. Now, just last week I was in New York City, and yes, it's a very, very expensive place. And I went to a supermarket and looked at the bell peppers. They were $5.90 per pound. So look at there's no balance here. It's an imbalance here between what you can do in food rescue and what the real cost is. And I think that's the huge part of food rescue. We can show a great savings, a ratio of a great savings here. And then the environment, and now I'm back to your question, sorry for this, but yes, we did a study. It's our 7th study that came out, 7th annual study that we're doing, and we found that 6%, the impact of food waste in Israel is 6% in greenhouse gas emissions, which is huge. The Israeli government has the goal of 15% a year to decrease the GHGs, and only food waste is responsible for 6% of that, and that's only in GHG. If you look at like water, and maybe I can quantify it a little bit different, the water that is wasted is about 100,000 Olympic swimming pools that's wasted, that we're using. And Israel is a country that needs water. We're desalinating water, and on one hand, we're desalinating water, we're saying there's not enough. On the other hand, we're wasting 100,000 pools of water. So again, there's an imbalance here that needs to be dealt with, not to mention all the gas that's put into it and the power that's put into it. So this report really talks about, and it's available out there I think when we have lunch, there's a few reports, but it's also available online. And it was done with the Ministry of Environmental Control in Israel, so it has a stamp that the numbers that we quote there are true and real. It's not like the first report that we had years ago, that after the first report came out and I said that Israel is wasting 35% of food is wasted in Israel, then I got a call from the Ministry of Agriculture saying that my numbers were way off. And I said, okay, I'll give you a 50% discount. Isn't it enough anyway? So I think that we have an impact as food bankers on the environment, just to sum what I said before, but these are tools that we can use to promote the idea, to promote fundraising, but our core business is feeding the people.
Escuché por ahí unos aplausos. Por ahí escuché.
Thank you so much again. I'm going to invite you to download the app, program meetings with our presenters here, because I think there's a lot of information that you can discuss with them. On the app, we're also going to share the study that Gidi performed. And if Gidi allows us, we would love also to know, I know a lot of our food bankers that are present here, and they would love to know the technology that you used and that you're talking about that allows us to increase food rescue, fruits and vegetables rescue. At the end of the day is in our interest. We're also going to have a section on technology that's going to be very important, because nowadays we know more than ever that without technology there is no future, and that's where we are. So this is very important to establish that link. We have our colleague Rafael Cruz. Rafael, if you want to raise your hand. Rafael has the microphone. For anybody that has any questions at any point, we will be paying attention and take the microphone to you. Jacques, with this new perspective, 2012, we put it on the public agenda, food and waste and loss, and then with the sustainable development goals, we have a very specific indicator for food waste and loss, and that puts food banks in a new place, in a new role to face the solution to these public problems, not only from the environmental perspective, also as far as the impact that this has on the most vulnerable population and how we can end with hunger. At the end of the day, that is the mission that we all need to maintain. So are you seeing new organizations and different organizations that are approaching you, new companies that perhaps in the past had never approached you, and nowadays they look at food banks as a new partner or a different partner?
It's a very important question that you are raising there. Let me first say as a preamble that I'm very happy because I have numbers here on my computer and on my notes. And I see that in the European Union, the food waste has generated an equivalent of 227 million tons of CO2 equivalent, which is more or less 6% of the EU emission. So your numbers are very, very much comforted with ours and vice versa. I must be honest with you, even if climate change is becoming more and more a topic of interest for companies, the various challenges that we have faced in the recent years and we are still facing have not left much space for concentrating on environmental issues or the quantification of environmental issues. I don't need to remember you the hard years of COVID and now the repercussion of the war in Ukraine. However, I can say that more partners and supporters are more sensitive to the issue. They are looking, I think, more and more at the importance of sustainability in their operation mode, and because they are a bit forced by that. The policy document of the European Union, from farm to fork and so on, are actually pushing the various sectors and the food sector in particular to actually reorganize itself so that it is more concerned about the environmental impact of their activities. As far as the food banks are concerned, I think we have reached a level in our talks with the European platforms where food banks are part of the food system. It's not a charity anymore. Food banks are part of the food system and are considered as such by the various stakeholders and the partners, which I think is an enormous progress towards achieving our goals of reducing the environmental impact. To answer part of your question, we have not seen a big change in the companies approaching us and our members, but surely whether they approach us or our members, we have never heard something drastic happening. But there are new motivations that guide all the new supporters towards a push for action for these times. I think there is the consciousness that the issue of sustainability is the issue of the century if we want to be around in 2100. Even if you look at the New York Times this morning, they even say 2030 may become a crisis year because we may exceed another threshold in terms of climate change. I'd like to conclude by citing a person that we had the opportunity to meet in 2019 in Rome. And that was nobody else than His Holiness the Pope Francis. And he said something that we have now put in golden letters in our office. The work of the food banks is like that of trees, which breathe in pollution but give back oxygen. And like trees, we do not keep the oxygen. We distribute the quantity required for living so that it reaches those in need.
Thank you. Bram, we think definitely that we need to have more resilient food systems. There are no doubts about that. No doubts. As we reach these more resilient food systems, we want to see an agro sector that has more capabilities for marketing, better prepared for climate change. How do you think us, as food bankers, can power up the work that we're doing with the agro sector? What do you think would be the fundamental elements in that conversation?
First and foremost, especially also after those words, be proud of what you already do. You can be very, very proud. I mean, you were a hero. I mean, many of your collaborators went above and beyond during the COVID crisis. You were there, you responded. So don't forget that and talk about it. And I don't say this free. I say this because I was visiting farmers out there who were struggling, and you were there. We were in the same field, so side by side. Now you asked a couple of reflections on what to do better. I heard a strong element here of data, and I think it is very, very important that we all start as organizations active in the food system. Our trip from data to information, from information to decision making, and from decision making to decision taking. Data on its own is worthless. If we cannot turn it into information, that information into decision making, and then decision taking, many can actually make the decision, but are then not able to act upon that decision. So I think you have a role to play to give those data back, so they become a decision-making tool. Do already better what you are good at. So by no means I'm here to advocate to go out of the mandate. It is rather to do better what you're already good at. And why I was listening here, I think you're in the business also a little bit of avoiding, right? It is avoiding something to happen. So an element and maybe a challenge is look at it from a risk lens. If you look at it from a risk lens, by avoiding, which risks are you mitigating? Which impacts are you having on future potential risks? Last but not least, look at those bananas in the slide. If I look at those bananas, in my head, those bananas can be either very green. I know they're yellow, I'm not colorblind, but in my mind, those can be very green bananas, or they can be very red bananas. And today in the market, there's no differentiation between green yellow bananas or red yellow bananas. What do I mean? There is no difference between a banana produced with very high use of water, with very high use of energy, with very high use of herbicides, pesticides. There's only extreme differentiation, when you go to niche markets. But we are in the business of this midsection. There's no differentiation. You do have the power to make that differentiation, which would be a clear incentive for those farmers there to produce green, yellow bananas. Don't underestimate your power of the data that you could insert into your system and send that incentive. Because if anything, we never want to be an excuse for not changing and doing something better. It's like in my organization, we have to be very careful. It is not because we can make wheat resistant to drought that we should not avoid more drought in the world. We cannot become, because there is a solution, we cannot become the excuse for the problem in the first place. Thanks.
Yes, Bram.
I would like to know if there are any questions from the audience. Rafael Francia from Costa Rica. Thank you. Yes, hello. Well, good morning. Francia, I'm a director of the Food Bank in Costa Rica. I have a couple of questions related to, well, it's more for GFN as a global network, as a support network. The first question would be, I think that many or most of the answers have already been given by the panelists, and it has been really interesting by validating what we already know, but already knew. But if we know already about this importance of this, how do we acquire those skills or the capacity to show the data correctly? And in order to reach decision makers and those who implement those decisions, I mean, we have to talk to them from a perspective that reaches them, that resounds with them. Because if we tell them initially, as I believed a few years ago, that is, donate to me because you have, and there are people with hunger, suffering hunger, that's not convincing, that's not enough. So what data should we show? How could we show them correctly? And the second part of this question would be more, how can we get involved in those fora where decision makers are involved? How do we show our results at those decision maker forums? And this impacts two areas, from the government point of view, how to have a healthier population, how that impacts the security in society. And the second one is how do we have an impact on companies, on corporations. In one of the sessions that I conduct, I tell people how not to waste in their homes. You know, go shopping with a shopping list. Go shopping after you've eaten so you're not doing impulse buying. And a retail ally was saying to me, why do you tell them that? Let them go and spend a lot of money. So how do we make an impact so they can see us as allies, so companies can see us as partners, allies, and not as the enemy? And also, how do we become allies of the government? Many questions there. Thank you, Francia. I'm not going to answer from the standpoint of GFN because we have great panelists here who have their own perspective on that. But then we will continue discussing this in this session. We're going to have sessions about the data issue, and we will be navigating those. And Alyson, Jacques, any of the three questions that Francia asked, can you answer?
Yes, I think I've got examples. I don't think I've got the solutions, but a couple of things that we've done which might be of interest. So first of all, we conducted some research on the social return on investment of the food that goes to our charities. And this tracked what's called the negative pathways that the service users would have created for the government to pay for if, for example, isolated older people go to see their doctors more often, maybe before the pandemic, not now, and that takes time, or people suffering from addiction create problems in their communities because there's crime or other incidences. So we did some research and we reflected back to government that it costs them £60 million, or it would do, if the charities that we supported weren't providing the services. And when they heard that if FareShare wasn't there, they would have to pay £60 million to cover these sorts of costs, they immediately listened and started talking to us about funding a pilot scheme, which we did really well on. They haven't completed or repeated their funding yet, but it certainly made them listen. So I think that's number one. Number two, we always aim to work in partnership with food companies, and I understand the point that you're making, which is where the environmental reporting helps, because these companies want to look good, and they want to look good to consumers, they want to look good to their investors. So having relationships with their public affairs departments and their marketing departments is important, because being cynical, if they look good, then they will have better loyalty from their customers. So I think those are the things that help. It may not change the situation as to how you get certain food and how we get more food, but we've certainly found that those are enablers in our relationship management. And a new scheme that we've introduced over the past year is a partnership scheme where food companies can say, we're working with FareShare and we've created this number of meals. So it's loyalty, it's recognition. So we're trying those, but I do think the whole marketing side of things and public affairs and shareholders are really important audiences that these companies want to have a good experience with.
Alyson, gracias. Y Alyson introduce un concepto muy interesante.
Alyson, thank you. Alyson introduced a very interesting concept. The companies are using that now. They go from being stakeholders to shareholders, or we become shareholders. But that's important. What's the level of commitment of all interest groups, all stakeholders, not only the companies that are created for profit, but also us as non-profit organizations. Jacques, Gidi, I don't know if you have any final words, or?
Although I'm already on the red light, but we have, since 3 years now, we have embarked into getting data, consolidated data from 30 different countries into one single food donation observatory. And I can tell you from our experience, it's not an easy exercise. First of all, we need to have KPIs that have the same meaning for everyone. Not a simple thing to do, but important thing to do. I appreciate Bram's comment on the fact that collecting data, and we're collecting data on what we do, but that must also be put into balance with what is happening in the food world. For that, I think in Europe we are pretty well served by Eurostat. We have an enormous database where we can pull some, but it is important, in my opinion, to put those things together. And finally, I would like to say, don't forget the pressure groups. We presently, in Bram's and mine country, we are living a strike of a large distributor who wants to franchise all its shops. And you cannot believe how much bad press it is attracting, because it doesn't give the food that is left to rotten to food banks. And that, obviously, I think the general opinion, the general public education, sensitivity to those type of issues has increased dramatically, and that is also a point where that you can bring in when you talk about not the P&L account of the distributor, but its social responsibility.
Muchísimas gracias.
I just want to add maybe one thing to this, and it's going to the same theme that I was talking about before. It's stay focused. As food bankers, we need to stay focused on our mission and stay true to our core values in this. And we need to adopt technology faster maybe than any other organization in the world, because our sustainability, I think, relies on technology, or will start, or maybe it's currently, maybe it's a little bit in the future. We rely on better technology, better use of data. And if I can offer one piece of advice, then forget the governments. They won't help you, not initially. Just rely on yourselves. If anyone wants to hear more about government, then my colleague is here.
A nuestros panelistas, muchísimas gracias por esta gran sesión.